Okay, we have seen that 45 degrees, 30 degrees, 60 degrees, and any multiples of these show up over and over and over again. We need to be familiar with their radian measures so that we know if they say a certain radian measure, we know, oh, that's the same thing as 45 degrees, or that's the same thing as 30 degrees. And so we're going to do that right quick just to have in one spot so that we can learn it and be able to use it pretty easily. Okay, so we know we've got 0 degrees, 180 degrees, this would be 90, this would be 270. Okay, if we're looking at 45 degrees, that would be 45, 135. 180 plus 45 would be, how much? It would be 225. And 270 plus 45 degrees would be 315 degrees. So those are some common angles that involve 45 degrees. Remember, the trig functions for all of these are going to be the same, but the signs change, right? Depending on whether we're first quadrant, second quadrant, third quadrant, or fourth quadrant. So that's why we need to know them. We need to know we're dealing with a 45 degree angle. We need to decide what quadrant we're in, and then we know the sign of our trig function. So what we do, we look at this and we say, well, we know 180 degrees is pi radians, right? So 90 degrees would be pi over 2. It'd be half of pi, right? And that would make, if we go all the way around, pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, this would be 3 pi over 2, right? So 270 degrees would be 3 pi over 2, and then 360 degrees would be 4 pi over 2, or 2 pi, right? So we've already said that. All the way around is 2 pi, halfway around is pi. So what is half of pi over 2? 45 degrees is half of pi over 2. Well, what is half of pi over 2? Half of pi over 2 is pi over, if I could write it correctly, pi over 4, right? And we can do this all the way around. We could say pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, right? That's pi over 2. So that makes 135 3 pi over 4. This would be 4 pi over 4, which is just pi. This one would be 5 pi over 4. 6 pi over 4, which simplifies to 3 pi over 2. This would be 7 pi over 4. And then 8 pi over 4 would be 2 pi, or 360 degrees. Okay, so these right here are the radian measures that have to do with, particularly these in the quadrants, that have to do with 45 degrees. Now, what about 30 and 60 degrees? Okay, they're related. We looked at their trig functions. Their trig functions sort of swap from each other depending on which one you're looking at. So this is 0 degrees, and let's go all the way around. 30, 60, 90, 120, 150, 180. Then this would be 210, 240, 270, just like we would expect, 300, 330, and then all the way around is 360 degrees, right? We already know that 90 is pi over 2. We know this is pi. We know this is 3 pi over 2, and we know 360 degrees is 2 pi, okay? What about the 30 degrees and 60 degrees? Well, you have a couple of ways to do it. Here's one way. If 180 degrees is pi, 60 degrees is a third of that, right? 60, 120, 180. So if 180 degrees is pi, 60 degrees is a third of that, or pi over 3. Okay? That would make 120 degrees 2 pi over 3. Now, what would that make 30 degrees? Well, 30 degrees is going to be half of the 60 degrees, right? So 30 degrees is half of pi over 3. So 30 degrees is a sixth of pi. Actually, it takes 30 degrees to make 180 degrees, right? So it's a sixth. Now you can fill out all of them. Now here's one thing I did to help me remember when I was doing this, when I was learning trig. Notice the 6 and the 3 go together. 30 degrees is pi over 6, 60 degrees is pi over 3. So they're sort of reversed from what you might expect. So if we go all the way around, pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, which is pi over 3, 3 pi over 6, which is pi over 2, 4 pi over 6, which would simplify to 2 pi over 3, 150 degrees would be 5 pi over 6, right? And that doesn't simplify. 6 pi over 6 becomes pi. This would be 7 pi over 6, which doesn't simplify. 240 degrees would be 8 pi over 6, but that would simplify into, or 4 pi over 3. This would be 9 pi over 6, which simplifies. 10 pi over 6, that's going to simplify, right? 10 pi over 6 is going to become 5 pi over 3. This would be 11 pi over 6. And then 12 pi over 6, or 2 pi, would be 360 degrees. So if you know the simplified versions, you can quickly recognize when something is a 30-degree measure or a 60-degree measure, and remember, you would just have to decide which quadrant it was in to decide your sign. Knowing the simplified is good, but you might also want to be sort of kind of familiar with the unsimplified versions. Sometimes that just helps you out. Okay, so there are some common radian measures for multiples of 45 degrees, multiples of 30, multiples of 60 that you'll want to become familiar with.